So, what if the phone in your pocket could actually give us a window into your mental health? It sounds like science fiction, but a really groundbreaking study in JAMA Network Open by Ringwald and colleagues explored this exact idea. They used passive sensor data, stuff your phone collects anyway, to detect signs of psychopathology. Let's break down what they found. Here's how we're going to walk through their work. First, we'll look at the big challenge they were trying to solve. Then we'll dig into their methods. After that, we'll unpack their two huge findings. And finally, we'll talk about what this all could mean for the future of mental health care. Okay, so what's the core problem we're even talking about here? Well, traditional ways of assessing mental health often miss the bigger picture. A clinical visit? That's just a tiny snapshot in time. And self-reports can be biased and only happen every so often. This leaves these massive gaps in understanding a person's actual day-to-day life. Which leads to this really central question, right? If our current methods are only giving us these brief, scattered snapshots, how can we possibly get a more continuous and maybe more importantly, a more objective look at someone's mental state? And that's where this fascinating concept called digital phenotyping comes into play. It's the idea of using the data our smartphones are already collecting, passively, in the background, to build a real-time objective picture of how we behave. And from there, we might get a better picture of our well-being. When you see them side by side, you can really see the fundamental shift. We're trying to move from a system that's episodic and subjective to one that's continuous and objective. So instead of just relying on what a person can remember or decides to report, we get data that reflects their actual real-world behavior. It's what researchers call ecologically valid. Okay, so that's the theory. But how did the researchers actually put this idea to the test? Let's get into their methodology. First off, this wasn't a small study. They built it on a really solid foundation with a robust sample size, 557 adults. So for 15 days, these participants' phones just quietly and continuously collected data from all sorts of passive sensors, GPS, motion detectors, call logs, you name it. Then, this mountain of behavioral data was compared against their psychopathology scores, and importantly, those scores were assessed using HiTOP, which is a much more modern framework that sees mental health on a spectrum, not just as a simple yes or no diagnosis. And this brings us right to their first major set of results. This part focused on behavioral patterns that seem to be common across many different kinds of mental health challenges. The data showed some pretty clear moderate correlations across all the major domains of psychopathology. But check out the two at the top, detachment and somatorm, which involves having physical symptoms without a clear medical cause. These two showed the strongest links, which is a really clear signal of the connection between digital behavior and mental state. Now, what's really fascinating is how they analyzed all this. They looked for something called the P factor. You can think of it as a kind of general dimension of psychopathology. It represents those nonspecific symptoms or features, like general distress, that are shared across a whole bunch of different disorders. And they found 4 very specific behaviors that were linked to this general P factor. People with higher general psychopathology tended to be less active, spend more time at home, go to bed later, and, this is a fun one, they let their phone battery run lower. The researchers think this could reflect anything from just being a night owl to maybe pointing to deficits in planning and organization. But this is where the research gets even more powerful. The team didn't just find these general markers. They actually managed to isolate behavioral signatures that are unique to specific domains of psychopathology. They moved beyond the general to the specific. And this is really the key finding. After they mathematically adjusted for that general P factor we just talked about, they discovered that 5 of the 6 domains still had their own distinct behavioral fingerprints. The only exception here was thought disorder. Let's look at an example to make this real. For antagonism, the unique signal was in their call behavior. Specifically, individuals who scored higher in antagonism made fewer and shorter outgoing calls. What might that mean? Well, it could suggest lower social initiative, or maybe more transactional, get-to-the-point communication instead of just chatting. Now, for detachment, the unique markers were all about mobility. Less time walking, more time spent at home, and visiting fewer unique locations. You can see how these behaviors line up almost perfectly with the core features of social and behavioral disengagement. Disinhibition had this one really powerful unique marker, a lower average phone battery charge. Again, maybe a sign of poor planning. Meanwhile, internalizing was uniquely linked to shorter but more frequent screen unlocks. You can imagine how this might reflect something like anxiety-driven notification checking.
So, what does this all add up to? Let's take a step back and summarize what these incredible findings could mean for the future of mental health research and even monitoring.
The author's own summary really gets to the heart of it. Major forms of psychopathology are in fact associated with these passively sensed behaviors. We can even identify markers for general distress. The implication here is pretty clear. This technology has some serious potential for both monitoring and research down the line. So the take-home message here is really threefold. First, it seems major forms of psychopathology actually leave a detectable trace in our digital behavior. Second, to do this right, we need to be able to separate those general, non-specific markers from the ones unique to certain conditions. And third, this research gives us a whole new way to study the day-to-day mechanisms that keep these conditions going. And as the authors themselves conclude, these results could directly inform how we develop new tools for monitoring symptoms, which could help fill the huge gaps we currently have in clinical practice. And this all leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. As this technology keeps developing, is it possible that the very device we use every single day could become a personalized, objective tool to help us understand and monitor our own mental well-being? The future of mental health care might just be right there in the palm of your hand.